I keep running across this idea on the internet that books are bad now. Or sometimes it's put even stronger, that modern books are garbage. The idea behind this is that at some point in time, books used to be good, and then something happened, and now they're bad now. And at one point in time, I think I might have agreed with this line of thought. I am someone who likes to read a lot of classic books, and I've certainly had the experience of picking up a contemporary novel and thinking that it was, pretty bad, pretty boring, not really that well written. And previously, I would have taken that experience with one or two of those novels and just generalized about contemporary literature as a whole. But I started thinking about the actual argument for this conclusion, and I realized that I was wrong. And I think that people who are claiming that modern books are bad now are wrong too. In fact, there's a lot of really great contemporary literature out there. The problem isn't that books are getting worse, it's that it's getting harder to find the good books. So let's start with some numbers here for a little bit of context. Publishers Weekly is a website that publishes, you guessed it, publishing news. And recently they reported that in 2025, there were about 4 million books published in just the United States. That is a huge number, obviously, and it's also a 32.5% increase from 2024. And when you hear that number, you might think, there is no way that all 4 million of those books are good. And that is almost certainly true. I am sure out of the 4 million books that were published in the United States last year, many of them are bad. And I'm sure that also many of those books might be good by some, metric, but they wouldn't be the sorts of books that I want to read. We need to try and break down those numbers a little bit, because just thinking about 4 million books being published isn't all that helpful. There's a writer on Substack who goes by the name Fisher the Bookseller. They are the book buyer for an independent bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky called Carmichael's Bookstore. And they wrote an article analyzing some of the numbers from Publishers Weekly to try and make sense of them, and I found it incredibly helpful. First, that 4 million number includes books that were self-published. Now, self-publishing is not what it used to be. I think even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago, self-publishing was largely seen as a vanity project. And if you heard that a book was self-published, you could reasonably conclude that it probably wasn't very good. There were exceptions, but it was a good general sort of rule of thumb. But self-publishing now is very, very different. There are writers who can make a real living self-publishing, and some of those writers end up getting some amount of critical acclaim. And there are examples in genres like romance and fantasy where self-published writers are putting out books that readers really, really like. But self-publishing is also easier than it's ever been. Basically, if you have a laptop and an Amazon account, you can write a story and you can immediately self-publish it on a place like Amazon. And because it's become so easy to self-publish, I think that it's fair to assume that there probably is quite a lot of low-quality writing that is being self-published. Which isn't to say that there isn't any high-quality writing that's being self-published. It's just that because it's so easy, anyone can publish anything, and that's probably not the best way to get the best books. And I don't think it would be fair to judge literature as a whole in 2025 or 2026 based on the fact that anybody can now self-publish a book. And it's not just that that 4 million number includes self-published books, it's that self-published books make up the majority of that 4 million number. In fact, the total number of self-published books in 2025 was about 3.5 million. That is a substantial increase from 2024. I assume that's because of the prevalence of AI-generated books. If you go on a place like Amazon, you will clearly see that AI-generated books have flooded that platform. So if we set aside self-published books and we only think about traditionally published books, books that were published either by what's called the Big Five, those are places like Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster, or independent presses, then the number of books that was actually published in 2025 gets substantially smaller. It goes down to about 640,000 books. That's still a huge number, but it's a much smaller number. It's a much more manageable number that we could actually try to evaluate. But that number still is misleading, and this was something that Fisher pointed out that was really helpful. You see, Publishers Weekly was not counting individual books. They were counting individual ISBNs. ISBNs are the unique identifiers that you find on the back of a book. It's like a barcode or a social security number for your books. And a single book might have multiple ISBNs because you need a separate ISBN for things like audiobooks, ebooks, hardcovers, paperbacks, and special editions, which are becoming more common. So if you published one book as a hardback, paperback, ebook, and audiobook, there is a chance that you are counting one single book up to 4 times in a given year's dataset. That brings our number down to about 164,000 books. And there's one more thing you need to keep in mind about that number. That includes books across every category and genre. So it includes fiction and nonfiction, of course, and we can break that down even further. It includes fantasy, science fiction, romance, literary fiction, women's literature, which is sort of its own publisher genre. It includes cookbooks, self-help books, puzzle books, and game books. It includes so many sorts of books that I don't think people always have all of those in mind when they want to say that books in the modern day are bad now. And when you break down those numbers even further and you look at just general books, including fiction and nonfiction, for the sort of generalist, non-specialist reader, that gets down to about 50,000 books per year. Now, this still leaves us with a problem, right? Because if you're a reader, there is no way that you could look at a catalog of 50,000 books and reliably find only the good ones. And it takes substantial time and effort, either on your part as a reader or on the part of the industry, people like Fisher who are choosing which books to stock in a bookstore in order to find, separating the wheat from the chaff. And I think that is the real reason why people say that books are getting worse. It's not even necessarily that books are getting worse. It has just become harder and harder for individual readers to find the books that they would enjoy reading. I started watching some videos and reading some articles where people were complaining about books getting worse. And in many cases, they wanted to blame the internet, and they really liked to blame TikTok. Now, I don't like TikTok. I don't post on TikTok. I don't consume TikTok. I do not have the app on my phone. But something about this argument strikes me as like a little bit too easy. Like, it's too easy to blame TikTok for all of our problems, right? And most people don't think that books got substantially worse in 2025. They think it's been happening for 10 years or 5 years, or at least the last couple of years. But TikTok didn't really get popular until 2019, 2020. And most of the books that are being published now were just being written around that time. This is something I don't think a lot of people realize, that publishing is a very slow industry. If a novel is being published in 2025, it has been sitting on an editor's desk for at least a year, and there was probably at least a year before that where it was going back and forth between an editor and the writer. And before that, the writer was probably working on it for several years, trying to find an agent, going through that whole process. So some of the books that are being published in 2025 were only just being written around the time that TikTok got popular. And I don't think that TikTok got popular and then immediately ruined literature, right? So the timeline just doesn't seem right, and I don't think we've identified the cause just yet. So that makes me skeptical of this explanation of blaming the internet and blaming TikTok, but I also don't think we're giving TikTok or the internet enough credit when it comes to actually helping people find books that they want to read. So last year I read I Who Have Never Known Men. It's a science fiction novel from the 90s. I really enjoyed. It tells the story of these women who are trapped in this prison sort of structure. They're guarded by men who won't even talk to them. And it's told from the point of view of this young girl who has no memory of the outside world. I enjoyed I Who Have Never Known Men, and the only reason I found out about it was because I was browsing my favorite local bookstore here in Austin, which is Book People. If you're ever in Austin, you should go check it out. I was browsing and I noticed that it was on the shelf, and I kind of liked how the cover looked, so I read the back blurb, decided to buy it, and it ended up being a really good book to read. But the only reason that I Who Have Never Known Men was even on the shelf at Book People was because it went viral on TikTok. You see, I Who Have Never Known Men was originally written in 1990. It was published in French and it was written by a Belgian author. While it does seem to have received some critical attention in the French-speaking world, as far as I can tell, it got almost no attention in the English-speaking world until the last couple of years. It went viral on TikTok in 2024, and then it sold 100,000 copies in the US, which is a huge number for a book to sell. Now, that was a great book, and one of the tragedies is that the author, Jacqueline Harpman, died in 2012, so she didn't get to enjoy the recent success of her book. And this story is sadly common. Really good books get written, and then they just sort of fade into obscurity. But every once in a while, partly due to the internet, but not always, some of these books can get renewed interest and people start reading them again. I Who Have Never Known Men likely never would have found its success if it weren't for the internet in general and for TikTok in particular. And this is a really weird argument for me to be making. I'm sure that anyone who watches this channel knows that I am very skeptical of the internet and of TikTok, but you got to give credit where credit's due. I was able to read a good book, and it was because of the people that everyone likes to make fun of. book talkers. One of the major benefits of the internet is that it can help you find those lost, interesting books that might have just fallen through the cracks when they were originally published. This doesn't mean that you have to go on TikTok if you want to find a good book. What it does mean is that actually finding the books that you want to read requires some work, some effort. And right now, because so many books are being published, if we don't put that effort in, we're never going to find books that we love. And that's why people then say, man, books these days, they really suck. Unfortunately, though, negative content on the internet does much better than positive content. I'm sure you have seen this for yourself. And so a video, a TikTok, or whatever about hating a book is always going to get more attention than a video that just talks about how much they love a book. But I can't help but wonder if we would all be able to find better books and be a little bit happier if we spent more time talking about things we loved rather than talking about things that we hated or that made us angry. And this is why I like going to independent bookstores. Major chains like Barnes & Noble mostly are just going to pick out books that are already popular, books that have already proven that they can sell well. That's their whole business model. But independent bookstores have more creativity and flexibility. And one of the things I really love about going to a store like Book People is that they'll have on the shelves just areas for the employees to recommend books. The first thing I do whenever I walk into a bookstore like that is find those shelves and look through it. And I've often really been happy with what I've found. Book People even does this thing where they wrap the books in brown paper and they write a description on it. It's called, a blind date with a book. And I bought a book like that once, and that was how I discovered Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, which I was incredibly happy to find. It ended up being a science fiction book that I love. In a world where you are being flooded with information, you need to find those sources that you can trust because they are going to direct you towards books that you would actually enjoy reading. So to sort of tell you where we are right now, I think that the real problem with the books are bad argument is that it's not reckoning with the fact that books could be equally good as they were, 20 years ago, but just harder to find. But I think there's also one other major problem with this line of thinking. People don't just say that books are bad now, they say that books have gotten worse. And when they're saying that they've gotten worse, they're comparing it to something, and they're usually comparing it to either some list of classic books that they like to read, or books that they read when they were younger. Let's talk about that second one first. When you first start reading, whether you return to it as an adult or you did it as a teenager or, it was when you were a young child, everything feels fresh and exciting. And that's because you don't have a lot of experience as a reader. So you pick up some book and you don't know that maybe it's hugely derivative or maybe it's actually not that well written. All you know is that you really enjoyed it. And that is a great period of life. Like my son right now is about 3 years old, and while he can't quite read yet, he likes to grab books, flip through them, and he narrates the pictures for himself. And the very last thing I would want to do is go up to him and say, those books, those are not that good. Here's a book that you would really like reading. Maybe one day I'll be able to do that, but he's 3. What am I going to do? Like hand him a copy of Plato? I'd be an idiot. And when I think about books that I read as a teenager, I remember nothing but good things. I remember all of them with fondness. I don't think I ever read a book that I hated, probably until I was at least in high school. And I was devouring books at the time. The moment I finished a book, I just picked up another one. My parents would take me to weekly trips with the library where I would check out the maximum number of books I could read every single week, go home and read them, and then go back the next week ready to read more. But if I looked at books that are written for teenagers now, I probably wouldn't like them that much. And that's for a pretty simple reason. I'm a man in my 30s. Those books aren't for me anymore. And even if I went back and read some of the books that I loved as an early teenager or as a child, there's a chance I would go and say, wow, these aren't as good as I remembered. And that's okay. That's just a part of getting older and coming to terms with the fact that you're old, the past wasn't actually as great as you remembered, and maybe somehow reckoning with the fact that you're going to die one day. When we non-critically compare books we're reading now to books that we read when we were kids or teenagers, we are just indulging in nostalgia. And I don't think that's a good way to start judging modern literature. But if we're talking about books that were only written for adults, you'll see people saying things like, yeah, this modern book that I read, it's not as good as like Tolstoy or Melville. And I want to say, of course it's not as good as Tolstoy or Melville. Tolstoy and Melville are two of the great geniuses. They are the exceptions. And if you read the contemporaries of Tolstoy and Melville, you would have also said, they're not as good as Tolstoy and Melville. If it turned out that every single year had a book that was as good as Moby Dick, that would be a miracle. And what we're doing when we compare all of modern literature to the great books or the classics is comparing this huge amount of books, maybe 20,000 novels every single year, to a highly selected and curated list of the best books that have ever been written. See, these lists of great books and classics, they're actually a fairly modern invention. A lot of it came up actually in the 20th century. And when people started to make those lists, they were trying to curate the best of the best. One of the early attempts to do this was called The Great Books of the Western World, which was edited by Mortimer Adler, who was one of the authors of the book How to Read a Book. You may have heard of it. That series begins in ancient Greece and ends with Sigmund Freud. So it goes to maybe 400 BCE, I'm guessing there, to the mid-20th century when Freud died. But there are only 52 volumes in that entire set. So it's saying that in this 2,300 year period, we have found the 52 best volumes that have ever been written. Now, it's not 52 books because within a volume there can be multiple books, but even if you multiply it by 5 or so, that's only 250 books, which comes out to less than one book per decade. There are other great books lists that you can find. They're all over the internet, and there are whole books that have been written about them. And they might have, 100 novels on the list. But even when you have 100 novels on the list, notice what we're doing. We are focusing on a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of all of the novels that have ever been written. So when you take any random book that has been published in 2025 and you compare it to that highly selected list of the best novels that have ever been written, yeah, it's not surprising that any random novel is not as good as the books on that list. That's like saying that you're stupid because you're not as smart as Einstein. You might be smart. You just might not be a genius like Albert Einstein. And so I guess I want to say that I wish people would just kind of chill out when they talk about how bad modern books are. If you actually go looking for those books, you'll often be surprised. I just read the latest book by Karl Knausgaard, whose name I only recently learned to sort of pronounce. I was never saying the K before then. It was called The School of Night. And I loved it. I thought it was great. I have a stack of about 20 or 30 novels that have been published in the last couple of years sitting on my shelf, and I'm just working through them. Do I love all of them? No. Do I think many of them are good? Yes. Do I think a lot of them are worth reading? Absolutely. So if you made it this far in the video, I want to ask you to do one or two things. First, I announced this in my last video, but I'm no longer taking sponsorships on this channel. So if you like the kind of videos that I'm making about books and philosophy, I'd ask that you'd consider supporting me over on Patreon or Substack. On Substack, I actually run a book club. This year, we're talking about the philosophy of technology. We're reading some novels, we're reading some philosophy, and I've been benefiting greatly from the discussions I've been having with my subscribers over there. You can also participate for free in that book club, by the way, so you don't have to pay me anything just for the pleasure of reading those books. The other thing I'd want to ask you to do is leave a comment where you talk about a good recent book that you've read. Because the people who think that books are bad are probably just struggling to find books that are worth reading, and we could do them a favor and make some recommendations. Maybe I'll see a book on that list too that I want to read. I would love that. All right, guys, this has been great, and I'll see you in the next video.